Who am I? As he sits there on the side of this mountainside, and his flock is grazing this pasture below him, he's asking himself that question: Who am I? Who am I that God would want to speak through him? Who am I that God would want to raise this guy up and use him to do something extraordinary? He's sitting there, and after this fiery experience, all these memories are flooding back into his life. You guys, you ever been there where something happens, something triggers, and all these memories start flooding back? And these were memories that he was hoping to outrun. These were memories that he was hoping that he would never have to deal with again. But on that day, something changed. On that day, as he sits there, the wind is starting to move in behind him and around and whip through the mountains. The sun is starting to set, and he's starting to feel the chill of the air. And he's sitting there, and he's bombarded by these memories. It's almost like this volcano that is erupting inside of him. He remembers what it was like to grow up within a mass genocide. He remembers what it was like for him to be the only male to survive his generation. He remembers what it was like to walk down the street. He remembers those glares from mothers that would look at him piercingly, because to them, he represented the death of their son. He was a metaphor for the massacre of his people. He was a metaphor for those times when God doesn't seem to really show up. Those times when God seems to be inactive. And after that fiery experience, he sits there on the side of this hill. Again, his flock is grazing. And he's trying to push these memories out. To top it all off, he grew up confused. And some of that confusion is now coming back. Because you see, his parents thought it would be safer for him to put him down a river and hope the crocodiles didn't eat him than to actually keep him. And so he grew up with this idea, this dysfunction, if you will, what it felt like to be abandoned by his family. So this man sits there some 40 years after he had tried to outrun those memories. And the memories come back and remind him that he actually, ironically, grew up in the home of the man who ordered the genocide of his people. So you want to talk about identity issues. This guy had them all. You want to talk about confusion. This guy had them all. And there was this anger, this built-up frustration that, again, he thought he had outrun. Like so many of us think that we can outrun. But just in that one fiery experience, it all came back. He's sitting there, and he's because of this eruption of memories, he's arguing with himself. You ever argue with yourself? He's arguing with himself, and he's saying, no, I was different than my step family. No, I am not that person. Because you see, it was his step family again that ordered the genocide of his people. And so one day he took it upon himself some 40 years ago to take revenge. And he himself killed a man. And so he argues with himself, saying, well, no, that was justice. What my stepfamily did was not justice. But he knew in his heart of hearts that one death was the same as thousands, and thousands was the same as one. But he sits there asking the question, God, why me? You can't use this. He's reminded of his dysfunction. He's reminded of the confusion. He's reminded of the anger that he thought he had pushed down for so long. He had ran from people. That's why it was easy to lead a flock of grazing sheep and other livestock. But God had another path. And you ever argue with God? Well, he tried to argue himself out of it by asking the question, who am I? And he, like most of us, don't win that argument, do we? You see, as I think through the pages of Scripture, and as I look at some of the men and women that God raised up to lead a people, I think one of the greatest leaders of all time was a guy named Moses. But I also, as I look at some of the most dysfunctional situations that anybody can live through, I as well think of Moses. I mean, how do you live within a family that caused the genocide of your people? Yeah, my family killed all my family. Is a thing that would be reoccurring in his mind. Talk about something you'd like watch on the Bio channel, right? Talk about a man that had built up frustration and anger. Talking about a man that would have confusion. Was he a Hebrew or was he an Egyptian? Talk about a man that would have those memories of mothers walking down the street blaming him for the death of their son. Why did my son die and you lived? So you want to talk about a recipe for dysfunction. I don't think you have to look any further than Moses. So it always amazes me when you look at a life like Moses. How does God take somebody that is so dysfunctional and move him into a place where he is leading a nation that frankly doesn't want to be led? That's what I want to talk about this morning. I'm going to be in a passage called Acts 7. Acts 7. It's past the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then you end up in Acts. It was written by one of the guys that wrote one of the Gospels, a guy Luke. He was a doctor. And he's given an account of a sermon that was given by a guy named Stephen. In Acts 7, starting in verse 17, it says, "As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt greatly increased. Then another king who knew nothing about Joseph became ruler of Egypt. So a new king became a ruler in a land that once favored the Hebrews, now despised the Hebrews and made them their slaves. It says, this new ruler dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would not die. And that is what Moses got to grow up with. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. Keep that in mind. I'm going to go back to that. He was no ordinary child. Some versions say that he was beautiful. For 3 months, he was cared for in his father's house. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. It says he was no ordinary child. As I said, another version actually says he was he was born beautifully. I don't know about you. My wife and I have had 4 kids. I have a struggle, forgive me, saying a baby is beautiful. Honestly, think about it for a minute. Now, when my first daughter was born, there was something that raised up inside of me, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. I'm a father, and for the first time, I understood something about God I never understood before. I understood a father's love. Now, I don't know if the child after that kind of changed or what happened, but I started seeing babies after that a little bit differently, honestly. And when a baby comes out, it looks like some sort of alien life form. Will you admit that? Am I serious? Right? Is that right? Okay. I want to make sure I'm not the only one. I remember two of my kids as babies. They did like this weird hand thing, right? And I've got pictures of 2 of them doing this weird hand thing. And so you read something that says Moses was beautiful. I look at the birth of my kids and beautiful. I would say them coming and how God brought them to be is beautiful. I would not say, I'm sorry, the act of birth is beautiful. You know, by the 4th child, if I could have said, hey, can you mind if I step out of this one? I probably would have done so. But I'm a better husband than that, so I did not do that. I did exactly as my wife told me, as I encouraged all of the guys in here to do, okay? Just to get that straight. Now, as kids grow, I love kids when they get to be about 2 or 3 years old because they're very formidable, right? In fact, my wife watches 2 little kids during the day. One of them, he's 2. And I have taught him to tell people, if you ask him, what do you like to do? He says, I like to party. And so for me, that's like awesome. I can teach this kid all kinds of stuff, then send him home. And it works out great, right? You know, my son Malachi, he's my oldest son. And again, kids can be so much fun. And there's something that happens as they develop from a baby into a child. But kids can be so much fun. I remember Malachi. We're sitting out somewhere. And when you have a family of 4, everybody stares at you wherever you go. And you actually just grow to a place where you don't even realize it anymore. At least I do. I'm like, oh, they're looking at you. Okay, cool. And but my son, we're sitting somewhere, and a lady, she was probably a grandmother, was kind of watching our family, right? I didn't even realize it. Like I said, I've kind of lost sight of that at this point. But my son Malachi realized this, right? And you know, this is, I just love kids. He looks at Grandma sitting across the room. I didn't teach him this. Maybe my wife did, but I didn't teach him this. He looks at Grandma and he goes, no joke. No joke. I am like, that was pretty funny. My wife is trying to discipline, and I'm trying to get my act straight so that I could help with the discipline, right? But kids are just hilarious. And so when I read here, it says that Moses was beautiful. It makes me step back and ask the question, okay, was God talking about Moses' appearance as he, like, boom, entered the world? I don't think he was. I think God was talking about what he had created within inside of Moses was something incredible. I believe that God purposefully, as I hope you would as well, put Moses in that time and place, allowed Moses to walk through the dysfunction of that family, to raise him to be the man that God desired him to be. And as I look through the pages of Scripture, I see no man that had such leadership ability, no man that was used by God in an incredible way than Moses. He led a people out of slavery and into freedom. On top of that, he pointed to the foretelling of Christ to come. And so when God says he created Moses beautifully, I think he's talking about who Moses was. Despite the dysfunction. Now, I grew up in a home. My parents were together. They loved me. They encouraged me. They helped me to decipher between right and wrong. I would say I grew up in a good family. But I would also argue and make the case that there was dysfunction. I would argue and make the case that there was dysfunction. You see, as much as my mother tried to shield me from things, there are still names I remember. There was still just that awkwardness as being a little boy, unsure of who I was. That awkwardness as a little boy, not knowing where I fit. And as much as my mother tried to shield me, I could see the scars in my family because of the alcoholism that ran rampant on her side of the family. I remember certain times I could visit my grandmother and certain times I couldn't. I remember as a child these voices. And I remember crying and covering my ears and telling my mom, please make it stop. I had no idea what it was at the time. Looking back on it, I wonder if it was demonic. I don't know. The reason I share that is because I believe that all of us have a similar story. I believe that all of us have something in our life that we can point to and we can say, that was dysfunctional. There's something that I believe Moses learned to do. You see, Moses had incredible potential, right? And we can either allow the dysfunction to have the potential to delay us or to deliver us. And oftentimes it's our choice. That dysfunction has the potential to delay us or to deliver us. You ever look at somebody and say, wow, you've got a lot of potential? Anybody ever do that? You know, even in your mind, you look and say, wow, they've got a lot of potential. When you're 15 and somebody tells you you got a lot of potential, it's like, man, this guy's going to become something, right? If you're 25 and somebody looks and says, you have so much potential. At 25, it's like, man, off to a great start, right? She is off to an incredible start. When somebody looks at you and you're 35 and they say, you've got so much potential, that's when the questions start, isn't it? It's like, there's a lot of potential, but what's happening? Right? Now, if you are 45, somebody looks and says, you have so much potential, something majorly has gone wrong. Right? They are not saying you have so much potential. They are asking you, what is the matter with you? If you are 55, somebody says you have so much potential, they are just saying, put your head in the dirt, dude, and wait for life to end. Am I right? And so Moses, though, he is 80 years old. God comes to him and God says, Moses, you have so much potential. Was God telling him to put his head in the dirt and say, it's over, dude? No. Because God realized something that we often don't realize, and that is that the dysfunction in Moses' life may have delayed him for a moment, but God had planned to deliver him using that dysfunction. Look, take a look. Let's continue reading. In Acts 7, verse 23. It continues on and it says, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian. So he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. And again, I wonder if Moses battled with that his entire life. God came to him and said, you are the man I am sending. You can't use me, God. God disagreed. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other? But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. How many times has our own dysfunction caused us to run in the direction away from where God was intending us to go? How many times do we allow our dysfunction to delay what God wants to do? And Moses ran. He ran for 40 years. He becomes a shepherd. I mean, after all, if you're running, it's easier not to be around people, right? And so he secludes himself. He marries, he has a family, but he secludes himself. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to look more closely, he heard the Lord's voice. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals. The place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt. This is the same Moses whom they had rejected with the words, who made you ruler and judge? This was the same Moses that grew up in the family of the guy that said, I want all this generation to die, and he made it happen. This is the same man who had mothers glaring at him, reminded as he became the metaphor for a massacre of a people. This was the same man that tried to outrun the dysfunction in his life. The same man that somebody would have looked at 30 years before and said, you have so much potential. But now 30 years later, God is telling him, you have so much potential, and I really mean it. Because you were born beautiful. You were born extraordinarily. So it leaves me, what happened? Because if you read in the beginning of Exodus, this is a man who led an entire nation. So how does a man lead an entire nation that at one time is trying to outrun the pain of his past? How does a man step into such a place of faith where he is moving full speed ahead? It says, if you look in Exodus, it says that God led him by a cloud by day and a fire by night. They didn't know the next step they were going to go. They didn't know what was next in the journey. But here is a man who, for all intents and purposes, I believe was one of the most dysfunctional men in all of Scripture. I don't know how you grow up in that situation and not be. And I think you see it played out all the way through his leadership in some ways. But I think you see the grace of God in his life in an extraordinary way that allowed him to lead an entire nation. I think Moses obviously had an encounter with God. Now, I remember as a boy having different encounters with God, right? Now, I didn't grow up in a Christian home where I was taught who Jesus was. I'm not saying morality. I was taught morality. I was not taught who Jesus was. And there was a huge difference there, by the way. But I remember having different encounters with God. I remember, and I don't know if it's so much my memory or the memory of what my family has told me, as a little boy sitting in the front pew at my grandmother's old Baptist church that I was probably at maybe 3 times in my entire life, glued in on what was being said from God's Word. But nothing changed. Then in junior high, middle school, I remember having an encounter with God, again being introduced to who God was, God tapping me on the shoulder and saying, here I am. But again, nothing changed. And I remember in high school having many different encounters with God, but again, nothing changed. Why is that? Because it was college, God, again, an encounter with Him, showing me who I was. The only difference was I was ready to say, God, I am dysfunctional. Because for once in my life, I realized how dysfunctional I really was. There was something in me that realized for the first time that I was truly broken. And as God looked at me and He said, Mike, you are extraordinary because I have made you so. Mike, you have so much potential. It wasn't a slap in the face. It was a reminder that I no longer want the dysfunction to delay you. I want to use it to deliver you. And it makes me stop and wonder to myself, how many of us is God looking at and He is saying, you have so much potential. But we allow the dysfunction from our past, and all of us have dysfunction. But we allow it to delay us from moving forward. As Moses fought for 40 years until that moment where he finally looked and he finally realized, God, who am I that you would use me? And you see a radical shift then. Instead of a man who is running from God, you see a man who is running to God. You know that they actually they have names for animals when they travel in groups, right? Let's have some fun here. You guys need to have some fun. What do they call a group of fish? School, that's a gimme. What do they call a group of fish? What do they call a group of fish? It's a school, but I only hear like this part of the crowd, not this part of the crowd. So this part of the crowd is very well educated. This part of the crowd is really struggling with that education deal, right? What do they call a group of fish? A school. Thank you. Okay. What do they call, let me see, do you guys know what they call a group of whales? Any idea? Yes, who said that? Pod, yes, pod. Okay. What do they call, let's see here, what do they call a group of lions? A pride. Isn't that awesome? I love that. You know another one that's really good? What do they call a group of tigers? No, not tigresses. No. That's Mrs. Tiger. What do they call a group of tigers? What's that? Confident? You know what they call them? I love it. They call them an ambush. Isn't that awesome? A group of tigers they call an ambush. Do you know what they call a group of crows? Yes, a murder. Isn't that awesome? I think that is so cool. Do you know what they call a group of flamingos? No. Birds are a flock. Flamingos, anybody? No. They're called flamboyants. They call them a flamboyant. Isn't that awesome? So when you think of your Aunt so-and-so and she's like, boom, you're going to always think of a flamingo now, aren't you? Yes. You're welcome for that. That's my gift to you. Do you know, let's see, do you know what they call, I actually wrote some good ones down here. Oh, this is really good. Do you know what they call a group of buzzards? No. Dinner? I love this. This is going to tell you so much about Awaken. They call a group of buzzards a committee. No joke. Okay? And so some churches will call their ministry, people that do ministry together, they'll call them a committee, right? We don't call them a committee. We don't want, buzzards waiting for them to die. No, we you know what we call them? It's very unique. A group of people who love Jesus doing ministry. Yeah, that's what we call them. Kind of crazy, right? The one I want to make a point with, if you know this, hold off on this. A group of rhino. Don't say anything, if you know. I want to explain to you about a rhino for a minute. Did you know that a rhino, and picture a rhino, we should have got a picture up. Picture a rhino, big and stout, right? Not like me. They've got this huge horn and this huge shield, right? Did you know that a rhino can run 30 miles per hour? Did anybody know that? Did you know that? A rhino can run 30 miles per hour. Think about it. That's faster than Richard. And a rhino is built like Richard, right? I would not play basketball or football. Heck, I wouldn't even play badminton with Richard, all right? Now think of Richard running 30 miles per hour. Did you know that a squirrel cannot even run 30 miles per hour? A squirrel can't run that fast. But you know what is amazing about a rhino? They can run 30 miles per hour. Their eyesight is horrible. They can only see 31 feet in front of them. Do you know what that spells? Bad news for anybody in front of a rhino, right? And so a rhino will run full force, 30 miles per hour, and have no idea if they're going to run into something or not. So you know what they call a group of rhino? I love it. Any idea? Does somebody here know? Yes, a crash. They call a group of rhino a crash. Isn't that incredible? And as I look at the life of Moses, as I look at this transformation that happened where he allowed that dysfunction to no longer delay him in his life, but he allowed it to become a deliverance that moved him to become the man that God originally created him to be, to lead a nation. You know what I believe happens there? He had this God encounter where he realized that dysfunction, and it moved him away from who he was, and it forced him to become a crash. Now, he was not as big and as stout as Richard, I'm guessing. Okay, most guys aren't. But I believe that when we choose to follow after God, wherever we're at in that journey right now, and it's a journey, I believe that God calls us to take steps of faith that would make us look like a crash of rhinos. And it's not ourselves that we put trust in, but I believe it's the shield and the horn of Christ that go before us that we put trust in. As the band comes up and continues to lead us in worship, I want to challenge you with that for a moment. I said a couple weeks ago that faith opens the door for opportunity. When we choose to run like a crash of rhino, do I believe that Moses was ready to run like a crash of rhino when he started to run? No. Do I believe that he was still dysfunctional as he chose to run? Absolutely. But I believe that as we choose to run like a crash of rhino, God begins to do a healing work in our life. Because we are putting ourselves out there, and it's not our strength anymore. It's not our power. We are saying to God, God, who am I that you would ask me? God, who am I that you would ask me to even know who you are? God, who am I that you would ask me to even try to understand who you are? God, who am I that you would have me just show up here on Sunday morning, having no idea of who you even are, and you are prodding me and saying, I want to have an encounter with you. Who am I that you would even do that to me, God? I believe that that is what takes a man like Moses and causes him to run like a rhino. I believe that that is what takes a man like Moses and doesn't delay him anymore, but you see the deliverance of Christ in his life. As a church, if you've been here for any amount of time, you've heard us talking about this thing called Reawaken 2016. And it's where we, as a leadership team, said, God, who are we? God, where are you taking us? God, what are you calling us to do? And it was us saying, we want to be that crash of rhino. We want to run full speed ahead, trusting that you are going to move, God. And if you were at the banquet last week or have been here for any of the weeks in the last 8 weeks, you would have heard us talk about this. If you're visiting with us today, I'm glad that you're here just to hear a little bit of who we are in our heart to see lives changed, to see your life changed. We set out 3 goals before us. And if you have this card, pull this out. We set out 3 goals before us. And the first one was saying we want to make sure that as a church, we are continuing to be on mission both here locally and abroad. That's why we did a Philly trip last month. That's why we're doing a DC trip you heard about this morning next month. And in order to help us to fully be on mission as a church, we said we believe God is calling us to have Jeff come on in a full-time capacity to do more than just lead worship, but to actually become a pastor that is going to help us mobilize and be on mission as a church. Our second goal with that was to, we believe that God was calling us, and have always believed that God is calling us to be a church that plants other churches. It's about the multiplication of the gospel. It's about us showing other people dysfunction and how God saves us from that dysfunction, honestly. And we believe that God is leading us to a place in Portsmouth to plant a church. We actually have a team on the ground there now. We have others that are moving there in the coming year. And we're forming groups there to take the gospel to that community. We also, within that second goal, believe that God wants us to widen our footprint here in Virginia Beach, to make sure that we are on mission as a people, sharing the love of Christ with those around us. And then our third goal is for God to show us a place that we can do leadership development, to show us a place that we can have some interns that are in training, to show us a place that the band can use for practice, we can use for administrative things, to show us what we call a flex space that we can use for many of those different things that are outside of Sunday morning. And as a church, we have challenged you, if you're a part of Awaken, to be praying and seeking God and saying, God, what do you want me to do with this? God, how do you want me to be involved with this? And honestly, for us, it is less about the dollar amounts of this campaign, and it's more about us learning how to stretch and grow in our faith. It's about us becoming a part of something bigger than ourselves. It's about us realizing the saving grace that Christ has had in our life. And we are inviting you to be a part of that. The banquet last week explained all this in much greater detail. If you're new and have questions on this, please come see me after. But we encouraged and challenged you today that today we want to make those commitments moving forward. If you did not remember to bring your card from the banquet, throw your hand up, and we have a greeter in the back that will give you a new card if you need one. Over here, there's a couple different places that explain all those goals, that walk us through that process. The first one is $60,000 to meet the first goal over 2 years. This is a 2-year campaign. This is above our current giving. The second one is $40,000 over 2 years. And the third one is $10,000 over 2 years. We have people that are committing to give monthly in addition to what they already may be tithing. We have people that are committing to give a one-time gift this year and next year. And we have people that are committing to do both. I want to encourage you to be a part of what God is doing here. Again, it's less about the money. It's more about us being a people that are on mission for Christ, running like a crash of rhino, to see God use us to do extraordinary things, just like Moses saw in his day. Moving past our own pain and dysfunction, and we're all there, and saying, God, who am I that you would call me? So here in a moment, the ushers are going to come down. They're going to take the offering like we normally take. Again, if you're a guest with us, we're excited you're here. We don't expect you to be a part of that at all. We're just glad you're here. But in that offering, we would also challenge you to drop this card in as you make a commitment to be a part of where God is leading us with Reawaken 2016. We'll take those one-time gifts today, as we said. Some of you have told me that, hey, I'm waiting for this or that to come in to give that one-time gift. That's fine. Just write on there what that is. And then our monthly giving, we're actually going to start in April, whatever that is on here. So again, I pray that you would consider being a part of where God is leading us as a church. I pray that you would not feel pressured, because that's not what this is about. This is about sharing with you where God is taking us as a church and inviting you to be a part of that. So feel free to fill that out and drop that in the offering as it goes by. And we're going to actually announce that at the end of today.